Welcome everyone to a reaction video. Today we are going to be reacting to Bay State's history video, Every President's Start in Politics Explained.
We've all got to start somewhere. Regardless of
Sure.
what field you're working in, you're not going to get the top job on day one. Today, I want to take a look at how each and every president got their start in politics. This doesn't necessarily have to be an elected office. As far as I'm concerned, volunteering, staffing, or activism in the political realm counts as a start in politics.
100%. You look at actually several different politicians got their start off that way through activism, through volunteering. And it's actually a really good way to enter in as it connects you with different people.
I won't be counting things like high school class president on this list. Student government is
Fair.
valuable and can spark plenty of
It
people's
is.
interest in politics, but I'm more interested in adult political involvement. That being said, I will talk about college or university political activities a few times on
I
this
was going to
list
say
because campus
that is
politics can
important.
oftentimes have an impact in the real world. I also won't be counting military experience in the traditional sense, but you will hear me talk about the military a few times because sometimes the two fields do intersect. Finally, before we get started, I want to thank Whippersnapper in the Vlogging Through History Discord server for this video suggestion. Alright, let's take it from the top. It's a common misconception that George Washington only won the presidency because of his military experience. While his status as General of the Continental Army was certainly the primary factor Washington was boosted to national prominence, he did also have prior political experience. Not only that, but Washington actually lost his first ever election. In 1755, Washington ran for a seat in the Virginia House of Burgesses, the predecessor to the Virginia House of Delegates. Washington, a young military officer at the time, finished third place in an election where two seats were up for grabs. After his election loss, he went back to his military service, commanding the Virginia Regiment in the French and Indian War. He resigned from the position in 1758 at age 26 and decided to try his hand at winning a House of Burgesses election once again. This time, he won first place, defeating both Hugh West and Thomas Swearingen, the two men who defeated him 3 years prior. There was
Hugh West, was the incumbent at the time. Swearingen held the position, I believe, briefly before West, although I could be wrong about that. If I'm
some bribery going on in this election. Washington surrogates offered potential voters 47 gallons of beer, 35 gallons of wine, 2 gallons of cider, 3.5 pints of brandy, and 70 gallons of rum punch. Nowadays, we'd consider this highly unethical, if not blatantly illegal, but back then this was commonplace. He continued to serve in this seat all the way until,
mind you, this is before the Revolutionary War, so America didn't have it. Well, it had some of its own separate laws, but it also had to follow the laws of Great Britain.
1776, and we all know what happened from there. Before we move on, I know at least one person is furiously typing in the comments right now that Washington's 1758 House of Burgesses win wasn't technically his entry into politics. And sure, you could argue that. 9 years prior to his House of Burgesses tenure, Washington was appointed as a surveyor for Culpeper County. Now, some of you might be confused. How would a surveyor count as a political position? Well, back in 17th and 18th century America, landing a job as a surveyor was a huge deal and considered a prestigious government position. Washington was even sworn in at the start of his tenure. So sure, you could consider Washington's 1749 appointment as surveyor of Culpeper County his true entry into politics, but his time in the Virginia House of Burgesses is what I think more people would consider to be his real starting point,
And I
myself
consider
included.
that as well.
Have you used social media between the ages of 8 and 18, and now you're dealing with anxiety, depression, or body image issues?
John Adams had an
I'm sorry about
incredibly
that. I did not.
accomplished career prior to his presidency. After graduating from Harvard, he worked
This is my first time doing a reaction video, and I intend for them to get better over time. But this, as Bay State History said in his video, you got to get a start somewhere, and you don't come out at the top right away. So this reaction video, Yeah, there may be ads midway through. I hope not too many. But and again, there are going to be other things. This is not a being filmed high quality, but everyone has to start somewhere. This is my first reaction video, and we'll see what level my reaction videos are at 5 years from now, 10 years from now, if they're even still going 20, 30 years from now.
Briefly as a school teacher before pivoting to the law. During his time as a lawyer, Adams began to gain prominence as a voice of opposition to British colonial rule, along with his second cousin, Samuel Adams. John Adams' first step into what would become his life's work came about on March 14th,
Mind you, both John and Samuel Adams signed the Declaration of Independence.
1763, when he was 27 years old. The Boston Evening Post published a letter by Humphrey Plowjogger responding to the Tory writer Jonathan Sewall. If you haven't figured it out, Humphrey Plowjogger was in fact not a real person, but instead a pseudonym used by Adams to write about aspects of political theory. These letters were critical of British control and the colonial Massachusetts elites. Okay, but when did John Adams publicly make his entrance into politics, not using a pen name? This came about just 2 years later with the implementation of the Stamp Act, a direct tax on the 13 colonies on stamped documents in order to recoup the cost of the protections provided by the British Army during the French and Indian War. Adams was highly critical of the Stamp Act and authored the Braintree Instructions.
Most people in the colonies were. Mind you, the Prime Minister at the time, George Grenville, was already not popular in the UK, and Stamp Act is one of the reasons why he ended up losing that position to the Marquess of Rockingham. Again, I'm not 100% sure if I'm remembering that correctly, but I'm pretty sure.
Rejection of the Stamp Act's authority that was sent to the Massachusetts General Court in September of 1765. Adams publicly backed the document, and it would become a major stepping stone on the path towards the American Revolution a decade in the future. The rest is history. Like his predecessor George Washington, Thomas Jefferson's political career also started in his mid-20s with an election to the Virginia House of Burgesses. To be precise, Jefferson was 25 when he first won election to the House in the year 1768. He represented Albemarle County for 6 years from 1769 to 1775, when he transitioned into the upper chamber of the Virginia legislature, the House of Delegates. During his time in the House of Burgesses, Jefferson was recognized for his writing abilities. Despite owning hundreds of slaves himself, Jefferson actually pushed legislation aiming to reform slavery. He also authored a resolution in 1774, organizing a boycott against British goods as a response to the Intolerable Acts. His writing talent would directly lead into his election to the Continental Congress, where, as we all know, he was chosen to draft the Declaration of Independence.
Well, he was one of 5. The others were, let's see if I can name them, John Adams, Roger Sherman, Benjamin Franklin, and Robert Livingston, who did not sign, although his cousin Philip Livingston did.
James Madison entered politics at the ripe old age of 23, taking a seat in the Committee of Safety in Orange County, Virginia in 1774. Despite the peaceful-sounding name, the Committees of Safety were actually local patriot groups that oversaw militias. Eventually, they became a shadow government of the colonies, taking control away from royal officials as the American Revolution waged on. After a year of serving on his local Committee of Safety, Madison was commissioned as the colonel of the Orange County Militia, second in command to James Madison, Sr. Madison continued to rise rapidly through the ranks of Virginia politics, becoming a close ally of Thomas Jefferson during Jefferson's tenure as governor of the state. Similar to his predecessor, James Monroe also got his start in politics in Virginia with the help of his mentor, Thomas Jefferson. Monroe served as an officer and later a colonel in the Continental Army under George Washington, where he very nearly died. After his time in the military, Monroe studied law under Jefferson, which led to Jefferson fostering the beginning of his political career. Monroe was elected to the Virginia House of Delegates in 1782, the successor to the House of...
And this is the first time we're going to see presidents start into politics be post the signing of the Declaration of Independence. It was not post-Revolutionary War, I believe, because it was still going on during that time.
Burgesses. Monroe was just 24 years old for his first election win. John Quincy Adams, as the son of John Adams, was surrounded by politics his entire life. Quincy was born in 1767, 4 years after his father began publishing the Humphrey Plowjogger letters, and 2 years after the Braintree Instructions. Identical to his father, Quincy's first political actions were a series of letters published under a pseudonym. This time, his name was Publicola. The primary focus of these letters were arguments against the French structure of government and going on the attack against those who believed that the United States should become involved in the French Revolution.
Mind you, France allied with the U.S. in the Revolutionary War.
Specifically responding to Thomas Paine. The first of these letters was published in 1791, when Quincy was either 23 or 24 years old. Adams' first official political position would come about 3 years later, in November 1794, when President George Washington appointed him as the U.S. Minister Resident to the Netherlands. You could argue this was just nepotism, especially considering Quincy's father was the sitting vice president, but I would have to disagree. Quincy was objectively qualified for the role. Between his strong education, successful legal...
He was, I would argue, America's smartest president. Knew several languages, was an amazing diplomat. And you'll see that throughout his time as Secretary of State as well. He became Secretary of State in the Monroe administration and even in his own presidency.
Legal practice, time living in the Netherlands, and the pro-Washington letters he had written a few years prior. The 1794 ambassadorship would mark the beginning of a political career spanning over half a century for Quincy, one of the longest of any American president. So, there are a few presidents who were appointed in legal roles by the public sector. We can debate all day on whether these should technically count as political positions, but it's my video and I've decided I'm going to count these. I didn't count presidents who were private lawyers like John Adams, except I did a couple times and we'll get to that later, but I will count public ones generally.
Right, and I think that it's a case-by-case basis.
Speaking, the first of which is Andrew Jackson.
Which I would
Jackson worked as a saddler and a school teacher following the American Revolution and then became an attorney. In 1787, Jackson entered the political sphere when he was appointed as a prosecuting attorney for the Western District of North Carolina, which is now Tennessee. Jackson was just 20 years old at the time, which makes me feel like I'm not doing enough with my life because that's younger than I am. Anyways, Jackson continued to move up the ranks in the legal world, being appointed Attorney General.
If I remember right, I think John Tyler became a lawyer at about 19.
Of the Miro District in Tennessee in 1791. His first non-legal role in politics came 5 years later in 1796, when Jackson was elected as a delegate to the Tennessee Constitutional Convention at the age of 29. Jackson helped build the young state and became the sole U.S. representative from Tennessee later that year. Martin Van Buren, Andrew Jackson's protege, was similar to his...
I noticed that you didn't mention it as well, but in addition to being representative, he went on to become, I believe, Tennessee's one of their first senators.
To his mentor in the sense that he began his political journey very early on in life. At age 18, Van Buren attended a Democratic-Republican Party convention in Troy, New York as a delegate. His cousin, John Peter Van Ness, was a perennial candidate for Congress in a special election for New York's 6th congressional district seat. Van Buren campaigned hard for his cousin and is credited with Van Ness's securing of the nomination and ultimate victory in the special election. It's fully possible Van Buren could have been active in politics at an even earlier age, but the 1801 convention in Troy is our earliest record of the future president's political activities. Van Buren's first elected office would come about 5 years later, as Kinderhook's fence viewer. This position involved the adjudication of disputed property boundaries. Van Buren would have been just 23 years old when he began the job
I
in
had no idea about
1806.
any of this.
Similar to John Quincy Adams, William Henry Harrison was born into a political family and surrounded by politics from a young age. Harrison's father, Benjamin Harrison V, was a Declaration of Independence signer and governor of Virginia. Harrison spent 7 years of his youth in the U.S. military, but temporarily resigned in 1798 to pursue a political career. Harrison's friend Timothy Pickering was serving as Secretary of State, which positioned him to campaign for a post in the government of the Northwest Territory. The Northwest Territory included modern-day Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota prior to their incorporation as states. Harrison became Secretary of the Northwest Territory under Governor Arthur St. Clair in 1798, a position which he served for a year and a half. Harrison was just 25 years old when he became secretary.
Wow.
On to another president that got their political start in the Virginia House of Delegates, we've got John Tyler. Tyler was 21 years old when he was first elected to the House in 1811, representing Charles City County. It certainly helped that Tyler's father was the governor of Virginia from 1808 to 1811, and a relatively well-respected one at that. During his time in the House of Delegates, Tyler was an outspoken anti-British voice, strongly supporting military action when the War of 1812 began during his second term in the House. He also supported a resolution for all viewers enjoying this video to subscribe to Bay State History. Tyler's House of Delegates service.
That's not the president that I would end up saying that with, but, well, for context, Tyler did go on to serve in the Confederate House of Representatives post-presidency, unfortunately. And was not during his entire term, Congress was undermining him, and he ended up resigning the governorship of Virginia because of a position he didn't like. So I wouldn't have said that on this one, but it is what it is.
Ended with his fifth term in 1816 when he won a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives from Virginia's 23rd District. Just a year after James K. Polk's graduation from UNC Chapel Hill in 1818, the future president made his first step into the political realm when he was elected clerk of the Tennessee State Senate in September 1819. Polk was 23 years old at the time and served in the role for 3 years while simultaneously working as a lawyer. Polk was successful in his role as clerk.
Right, and although it seems weird now for politicians to hold other jobs, back then it was actually fairly common.
And was recognized as a candidate for the Tennessee House of Representatives election in 1823, which he went on to win. Zachary Taylor is our first president to have never touched politics whatsoever until he ran for the highest office, and spoiler alert, by my criteria, he is the only one to ever do so. Taylor never publicly revealed his political beliefs prior to 1848, unlike some other presidents with no political experience.
Never voted.
In fact, Taylor never even voted in a presidential election prior to his own. Taylor
apparently can go from 0 to a complete site in just a single prompt with Wix Harmony. I don't know if this is going to be possible, or vibe coding meets.
Taylor had a negative opinion of the majority of politicians. He ran almost exclusively on his military track record, which had gained him a status as a national hero. President of the United States was the only political office Taylor ever held, beginning his tenure in 1849 at the age of 64, by far the oldest to enter politics of any president we've discussed thus far. He served in the position for only a year and 4 months before his death in 1850. Millard Fillmore stepped into the world of politics at the age of 28, supporting another president for their re-election bid. That president was John Quincy Adams, and the rise of the anti-Masonic Party helped Fillmore enter into the political sphere. Andrew Jackson, who was running against President Adams in 1828, was a Mason. Fillmore was more anti-Jackson than pro-Adams, but still endorsed the latter for his re-election bid at a New York convention. Fillmore continued to make the rounds that summer by attending local anti-Masonic party conventions and making his support for Adams known. The following year, Fillmore was elected to the New York State Assembly, his first public office. Similar to his predecessor Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce first involved himself in politics during the 1828 election.
Okay, so Adams won 16 of New York's 36 electoral votes.
Cycle. Pierce was 24
I
years
don't
old
know
at the time.
how
The year
active
prior, his father,
Fillmore
Benjamin
was
Pierce,
in
was
actively
elected
getting
governor
him
of New
those votes or
Hampshire as
not,
a
but
nominee of the newly formed New Hampshire Democratic Party. I would imagine the younger Pierce was a supporter of his father's campaign, especially considering their matching party affiliation, but I couldn't find anything on Franklin Pierce specifically participating in this campaign.
mhm.
Anyways, in 1828, Benjamin Pierce lost the support of Adams voters, which led to him being voted out when he was up for re-election. However, the same year, Franklin Pierce ran for a position as the town meeting moderator of Hillsborough, New Hampshire, which he won. Pierce was also actively campaigning for Andrew Jackson during the 1828 election cycle, which Jackson won. Pierce served a total of 6 terms as the Hillsborough town meeting moderator, each lasting a year. Pierce held a variety of other positions in New Hampshire politics, which led him to gain notoriety within the New Hampshire Democratic Party. This culminated in his nomination for a U.S. House of Representatives seat in 1832, which he won, marking the end of his state politics career and transition into national politics. The exact date of James Buchanan's entry into politics is difficult to pinpoint, but we do know that he served as chairman for his local Federalist Party chapter in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. My best guess, based on contextual evidence, is that he began this position in either 1811 or 1812, but like I said, that is a guess. At the very earliest, this could have happened in 1809 when Buchanan first moved to Lancaster. However, for the first 2 years he lived there, Buchanan was focusing on becoming a lawyer by training under James Hopkins. It's unlikely that he was also the chair of a local political party at the same time, but not impossible. At the very latest, he would have started this position in 1814, the same year he was elected by the Federalists to the Pennsylvania House of Representatives. I believe the year 1811 to be the most likely start of Buchanan's political career, but this could be slightly off. Buchanan would have been 20 years old at the time and 23 by the time he
Right.
ascended to the Pennsylvania House. Similar to George Washington, the other president that has ascended to legendary status in American culture, Abraham Lincoln, also had an unsuccessful first political campaign. At age 23, Lincoln intended to run for the Illinois House of Representatives in the 1832 election, even going so far as to declare his candidacy. He ran as a Whig, declaring his candidacy on March 9, 1832, and ended up getting 8th place out of 13 candidates.
Mhm.
On the bright side, he did nearly get unanimous support within his home precinct of New Salem. To be
Right.
fair, Lincoln volunteered in a company during the Black Hawk War for 2 months in the middle of the election season, taking his focus away from his political ambitions. However, this did not deter Lincoln. The following year, he began serving as the postmaster of New Salem. The year after that, in 1834, he ran again for the Illinois House of Representatives. He once again ran as a Whig, in strong support of the party leader Henry Clay. Lincoln got 2nd place out of 13 candidates this time, with 4 seats up for grabs. And so, at age 25, he began his tenure as an Illinois state representative, which would last for 8 years. Andrew Johnson got involved in local Tennessee politics almost as soon as he moved there in 1826. He originally planned to establish himself as a tailor in his new home, but started to involve himself in the political sphere quickly. In 1829,
And I believe he did, although he didn't do it professionally, he did remain a tailor throughout his life. And I believe made his inauguration suit.
Johnson helped organize a local Working Men's Party ticket in Greenville, Tennessee. The Working Men's Party was a labor rights party founded in New York City that same year, advocating for workers' protections and anti-corruption. I believe this same year, 1829, Johnson was elected as the town alderman, although this could have potentially happened in 1830. Johnson would have been just 20 years old when he first organized the Working Men Party ticket, and either 20 or 21 when he was elected as alderman. Also, I should mention, Johnson apparently participated in political debates at Greenville College during his time living in the town. I couldn't find a concrete start date on this, but it's fully possible he started attending these debates sometime between moving to Greenville in 1826 and organizing the party ticket in 1829, marking an even earlier start in politics for Johnson. Like his predecessor Zachary Taylor, President Ulysses S. Grant came from a military background, and the only elected office he ever served in was President of the United States. However, unlike Taylor, Grant did have a minor involvement in politics before then. It's difficult to measure just how political certain military jobs are. There's an inherent element of subjectivity in that gray area. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to consider Ulysses S. Grant's first political action to be his position as military aide to the governor of Illinois, Richard Yates Sr. This position began in 1861, at the onset of the U.S. Civil War, and also marked the beginning of the revival of Grant's military career. Grant was 39 years old at the time, one of the 5 oldest presidents to get their start in politics. This was somewhat of an administrative position in Yates's government, with Grant being responsible for organizing Union volunteers in Springfield and assisting with paperwork. For those reasons, I'd consider it to be enough of a political job to qualify for an entry into the field,
Right.
but I completely understand if someone would disagree with me on that. Like I said, some of these things are just going to be a little subjective, and if another history YouTuber made this video, they might operate under a different set of criteria. Alright, remember when I
Yeah.
said I wouldn't really be
I'd
considering
actually
private law
argue,
practice as much as public law when talking
Grant,
about
you could make a case to make it earlier, as he was involved at the military academies. I believe he attended debates there as well. So, and he did discuss his political views before the war as apolitical, but was raised with a Whig faction in his family. So you can make an argument for a little earlier for Grant, as you can with many of these presidents. I just figured I'd point that out.
a president's entry into politics, well, I'm going to contradict myself here, but hopefully you can follow my reasoning. In 1850, Rutherford B. Hayes moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, and began practicing private law with his partner John W. Herron. At first, Hayes was mainly dealing with commercial issues, but began taking criminal defense cases as well. Many of these cases included escaped slaves, many of whom came from Kentucky, the nearest slave state. Hayes was a staunch abolitionist that was personally devoted to ensuring the freedom of escaped slaves, and a useful byproduct of him taking on these cases is that it got him noticed by the local Republican Party. The Republican Party was created in 1854, and by 1855, Hayes had joined and began to establish a reputation for himself. I'm considering Hayes's entry into politics to be this year, when he was 32 years old. While he was technically working in the private sector, the cases he was choosing were inherently political by nature, which Hayes was well aware of and embraced. In fact, he was even
Right. Hayes was involved in political stuff during his college tenure, his time in college as well. He also took part in debates and seemed to be interested in the political system at Kenyon College.
even offered a Republican nomination for a judgeship in 1856, although he did decline that. James A. Garfield has a pretty cut and dry entry into politics. In 1856, at age 24, the future Republican president would campaign in Ohio for the first ever Republican Party presidential nominee, John C. Fremont. As you're probably aware, Fremont did not win this election, losing to James Buchanan, but
Fremont would have been a great president, by the way.
this didn't deter Garfield from the party. Fremont ran on an anti-slavery platform, which Garfield was in strong support of. This was believed to be a formative experience for the young Garfield, shaping his political beliefs and cementing his loyalty to the Republican Party as an early supporter. John C. Fremont would actually live to see Garfield become president himself, outliving him by almost 9 years after Garfield's tragic assassination in 1881. Interestingly enough, Chester Arthur's start in politics was incredibly similar to Rutherford Hayes. Both men were private lawyers that intentionally chose to work highly politicized cases defending African American civil rights. Chester Arthur joined the Culver and Parker law firm in 1854, which became Culver, Parker, and Arthur upon his entry.
My name is Anup Joshi. I'm the Chief Trust Officer at Trustpilot.
The same year, a free African-American woman named Elizabeth Jennings Graham boarded a New York streetcar owned by the Third Avenue Railroad Company. Graham was ordered to get off by the conductor, and after refusing, she was forcibly removed by a police officer. A movement began among Black New Yorkers to outlaw racial discrimination on streetcars, popularized by Frederick Douglass. Chester Arthur, just 24 years old at the time, handled Graham's case and won. The verdict directly led to New York City streetcars being desegregated, and gained Arthur the attention and admiration of abolitionists. Like Hayes, Arthur wasn't working a public sector job or anything, but I think it's fair to say that Arthur's handling of the case clearly established him on one side of a major political debate at the time. I'm well aware lawyers don't always have to personally agree with the people or causes they represent, but all evidence suggests that Arthur did. In 1863, at the age of 25, Grover Cleveland was appointed the Assistant District Attorney of Erie County, New York. This was smack in the middle of the U.S. Civil War, and Cleveland fit the criteria of an able-bodied man that would be called upon to serve in the Union Army. Cleveland decided to hire a Polish immigrant named George Baninsky to fight in his place, and continued his work as an assistant DA. Cleveland aligned with the Democratic Party, which was reflected in the law firm Rogers, Bowen and Rogers that he worked for at the time. The leadership consisted entirely of Democrats. In 1865, Cleveland tried and failed his hand at winning a promotion and his first political office, District Attorney of Erie County. He lost, but he would find success in electoral politics 5 years later when he was elected sheriff of Erie County in 1870. Benjamin Harrison, like other presidents born into political families, was surrounded by politics
Cleveland, I believe, is the only president to have been a sheriff.
from a very young age. At least 7 consecutive generations of Harrison men had been involved in politics before him, so it was a near certainty that Benjamin would follow suit. Harrison's first public service position came about in 1854, when he became a crier for the federal court in Indianapolis at the age of 20. If you don't know what a crier is, it's a position
Just can point out, I don't think I've ever seen that photo of Benjamin Harrison.
that consists of a few tasks, but primarily maintaining order within the court and waiting on juries. The following year, Harrison continued his public service career in the judicial branch by serving as a commissioner for the newly created U.S. Court of Claims. Also, fun fact, Benjamin Harrison was the final U.S. president to align with the Whig Party at some point in his life. His presidency began 35 years after the party's dissolution. In the post-Civil War era, the United States saw 5 Republican presidents from Ohio in less than 30 years, which you should know if you've ever watched a vlogging through history video. You'd imagine that these guys were bound to cross paths at one point or another, and this was the case for William McKinley and Rutherford B. Hayes. Hayes and McKinley served alongside one another in the 23rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry in the Civil War, becoming close friends despite their gap in age and rank. 2 years after the war ended, in 1867, Hayes secured the Republican nomination for governor of Ohio. McKinley was 24 years old at the time, and campaigning for his friend Rutherford Hayes marked his first step into the world of politics. Hayes won the election, and from this point onward, the two men held a lifelong political alliance.
In addition, that same year, McKinley formed a law partnership with a former judge. So you could count. I don't know which happened first in the year. I don't know if there are records of that, but it could have been earlier in 1867. But I don't know. It's a tomato.
Alliance until Hayes' death in 1893. McKinley received support from Hayes when he got into politics himself, beginning with his successful run for prosecuting attorney of Stark County in 1869. Theodore Roosevelt was the youngest president to ever serve, but he still had a political career spanning almost 2 decades prior to being sworn in as president in 1901. Roosevelt got his start as a New York State Assemblyman, winning his first ever election in 1881 at the age of 23. He proceeded to win re-election twice, continuing to serve the 21st District of New York. He quickly gained a reputation in the legislature, pushing strong anti-corruption legislation. Roosevelt even aligned with Grover Cleveland, governor of New York at the time, despite their opposite party alignments.
And Cleveland actually respected several members of the Republican Party because politics was not as divisive as it was today. It was divisive, but Cleveland pushed for hiring based on merit, regardless of political party.
William Howard Taft got his start in politics by campaigning for a presidential candidate in the party he would go on to win as, a trend which we'll see pop up more and more as we get closer to the modern day. In Taft's case, he was campaigning for Republican James Blaine's 1884 presidential campaign, an election which Blaine narrowly lost to Grover Cleveland. Taft was 27 years old at the time.
Okay. This is the first one so far that I actually actively disagree with. In 1878, Taft was involved in different. He became. I can't speak. I'm sorry. During his time at Cincinnati Law School, he ended up writing articles for a newspaper, and although not many of them, I think enough of them were at least clearly showed some political leaning in Taft. So this is the only one so far that I actively disagree with, though.
At the time. It's interesting how many presidents got their start in politics by campaigning for a losing presidential candidate of their same party. Funny enough, we'll see another James Blaine supporter pop up pretty soon on the list. But before we talk about James Blaine again, we've got to talk about Woodrow Wilson's entry into politics. Woodrow Wilson is a strange case because he spent much of his life in academia, famously serving as the president of Princeton University. This is an unconventional scenario.
Yep, was also their football administrator, only person to win a college football national championship and the U.S. presidential election.
Within the context of the rest of the list, but I'm going to say Wilson's introduction into the political sphere was actually with the publication of a book. When Wilson was 27 years old, Congressional Government was published, a book which was part expository but also contained plenty of persuasive writing outlining how Wilson believed government should be run. Wilson argued the government was not accountable enough, that the legislature should not be the most powerful branch of government, and that the rise of political party infrastructure was an area for concern. This book also served as Wilson's doctoral dissertation. I fully intend on giving this book a read at some point, and let me know if you'd be interested in a video on it.
I'd love to see a video on it.
Alright, it's time to talk about our best friend James Blaine again. When he was 18 years old, future President Warren Harding was working as a journalist in Ohio in 1884 and attended the Republican National Convention on a work trip. Teenage Harding was a fan of the Republican Party and James Blaine's, even apparently wearing a campaign hat supporting him. However, the county he published his newspaper in, Marion County, Ohio, was Democratic. He begrudgingly wrote a praise of James Blaine's opponent, Grover Cleveland, in the paper, deciding it was the smarter business decision. So, in a way, Harding's entry into politics manifested in support for both the Republican and Democratic.
And see, this was before Harding knew he'd become a politician. Now people would be like, oh, well, he's wishy-washy. But Harding wasn't thinking like a politician at the time. He was thinking as a business person.
Democratic parties, just in different ways. I guess you could view this as foreshadowing for Harding's willingness to sell out. Calvin Coolidge is another president who got his start in politics campaigning for someone else's presidential bid, but this time it was a successful campaign. 24-year-old Coolidge was a supporter of William McKinley's when he ran for the White House in 1896. Coolidge was a New Englander, a Republican stronghold throughout the back half of the 19th century and early 20th century, so it was no surprise that McKinley went on to win all 6 states in the region. Coolidge continued to speak positively of McKinley throughout the rest of his life, citing him as a major influence in his political career. Herbert Hoover was one of the presidents that got into politics the latest in life, not engaging in any overtly political work until the age of 39.
Right, and he didn't hold an elected office until the presidency.
Hoover spent much of his life as a businessman, specifically a mining engineer.
Give your business main character energy with Moo.com.
This changed at the onset of World War I, when Hoover was living in London. He was surrounded by American tourists who had no way to get home, so Hoover, who was incredibly wealthy by this point, decided to organize a committee to help his countrymen return home. Hoover's committee sent over 100,000 Americans abroad back to their country, and gained him the attention of Walter Hines Page, President Woodrow Wilson's ambassador to the United Kingdom. Page recruited Hoover to work with the Wilson administration by founding the Commission for Relief in Belgium. The CRB primarily focused on providing food to the German-occupied region, securing funding through donations organized through Hoover's connections in the business world. Because of this, Hoover is credited as one of the people who saved the most lives in world history. There is a case to be made that
Great
Hoover's
humanitarian.
humanitarian work wasn't overtly political, but he was working closely with the presidential administration in a role that would gain him international prominence and directly lead to his own presidency. Take it from Hoover himself, who said, "I did not realize it at the moment, but on August 3rd, 1914, my career was over forever. I was on the slippery road of public life." It's interesting that some of the most well-renowned presidents in history have started off their political lives with an election loss, because this was also the case for Franklin D. Roosevelt. However, the common theme with Washington, Lincoln, and FDR is that they didn't give up following their small-scale losses and went on to do major things. In 1910, a 28-year-old Roosevelt was working as a lawyer in New York for the firm Carter Ladard and Milburn. Roosevelt quickly grew tired of this and decided to enter the world of politics, partially inspired by his fifth cousin Theodore's presidency. Roosevelt was recruited by the New York Democratic Party for an upcoming state assembly election, partially because Roosevelt came from wealth and could pay for his own campaign. However, the incumbent assemblyman in Roosevelt's district, Lewis S. Chandler, decided to seek re-election after initially declining to do so. This ended Roosevelt's campaign for the state assembly, but there was still time before the 1910 elections. Roosevelt pivoted to a campaign for the New York State Senate, encouraged by his cousin Theodore. Roosevelt got an upset win for the Senate seat due to aggressive campaign tactics and a strong down-ballot performance from the Democratic Party in 1910. Harry Truman was another president that got into politics later than average, at the age of 38. Truman had one of the most average, middle-class upbringings of any president,
Right.
and didn't really have any political ambitions as a young man.
No,
He
did
worked as
not.
a farmer, served in World War I.
He only got into politics so he could make some money. He was America's poorest president, and growing up, he needed some cash, and so decided to get involved.
Speculated in
Only
real
reason.
estate, and even co-owned a men's clothing store at one point. Things changed in 1922, though, when Truman was recruited by the Democratic Party to run for a seat as one of 3 county court judges of the Eastern District of Jackson County, Missouri. The position title was a bit misleading, because this was actually an administrative job, not a judicial one. Truman won the 1922 election, and served a 2-year term before he was defeated in his 1924 re-election bid. This wouldn't be the end for Truman, though. He made a comeback in 1926 when he won an election as presiding judge in the Jackson County Court, which he served on for 8 years. You could probably get about 10 different answers for when President Dwight Eisenhower first entered politics, depending on who you ask and what criteria you use. Some of you are going to disagree with me here, and that's completely fine. We can have a respectful discourse in the comments. No matter how you slice it, Eisenhower entered into politics pretty late in his life compared to your average president, second to only Zachary Taylor. Eisenhower was a military guy through and through, and even rejected political position offers prior to his presidency. In 1948, President Harry Truman didn't think he would be able to win re-election, and actually offered Eisenhower the opportunity to run at the top of the Democratic ticket, with Truman as his VP. Eisenhower turned him down, and instead ran as a Republican in 1952. Anyways, throughout World War II, Eisenhower was working closely with the Roosevelt and Truman administrations, but strictly in a military role. I'd consider Eisenhower's first political adjacent job to be his time as military governor of the US-occupied Germany in 1945. Yes, I know a military governor isn't the same thing as a traditional governor, but Eisenhower had to oversee the post-war administration. This job helped him prepare for his presidency, so I'm considering it the first political task of Eisenhower's, even if he wasn't aligned with a party or anything. Eisenhower would have been 54 years old when he began this job in 1945. John F. Kennedy, like a few other presidents, was born into a political family. Kennedy's father was probably more involved in his political career than any other presidential dad, and this was Kennedy's entry point into the political world. Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. served as the U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom from 1938 to 1940, and while the younger Kennedy was still in college, He assisted his father with the job and represented him on several occasions. During Kennedy's 1938 summer break, when he was just 21 years old, he and his brother Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. traveled overseas to work at the American Embassy in London. He did the same in summer 1939, in addition to traveling across Europe in preparation for his Harvard Senior Honors thesis. Kennedy returned to
Right.
London on September 1st, 1939,
And
the same day
it
the
was
Nazis
Kennedy's brother who wanted to be president, and everyone thought was going to be president.
invaded Poland. Kennedy and his father were present for the House of Commons session when the United to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1946. Lyndon B. Johnson took a great interest in politics from a young age, organizing campus politics in an incredibly transformative way for the time. In 1926, at age 18, Johnson enrolled at Southwest Texas State Teachers College, which I'll be referring to as his school from now on because even that name is too long to abbreviate. At his school, Johnson organized debates, edited the school newspaper The College Star, and persuaded his peers to join his Democratic Party-aligned organizations. Some folks might not consider college campus politics to classify as a true entry into the political world, but like I said in the intro to this video, they can have an impact in the real world and serve as recruiting centers for major parties and organizations. Johnson's time at his school directly led to the beginning of his political career, starting as a legislative secretary to U.S. Representative Richard Kleberg in 1931. After serving in World War II, a young Richard Nixon was deciding upon his future career when a major political opportunity basically fell into his lap.
Imagine being able to build anything just by thinking about it. Meet Base 44, a complete.
The Republican Party was strategizing how to win a competitive seat in California's 12th district and seeking a fresh face to defeat the Democratic Party incumbent. Herman Perry, a Bank of America branch.
Okay. With Nixon, this is the second one that I disagree with. He was involved in collegiate activism, and I believe became student body president on a campaign to allow dancing.
Branch manager and California Republican, suggested his family friend Richard Nixon that he knew from serving on the Whittier College Board of Trustees prior to World War II. Nixon quickly agreed and began a year-long campaign in 1946, which resulted in a decisive victory for him on Election Day. Fun fact, Richard Nixon and his future political rival John F. Kennedy both won their first House of Representatives elections on the exact same day. Nixon was 33 years old for his House of Representatives win, and served in the seat for just under 4 years before moving up to the Senate. Gerald Ford was 6 months younger than his predecessor Richard Nixon, but he got involved in politics 6 years earlier. In 1940, a 27-year-old Ford went out and campaigned for one of the most forgotten major party candidates in the last 100 years, Wendell Willkie. Ford was inspired by Willkie's speeches and changed his mind on American isolationism after hearing Willkie's position on the matter. Ford put a significant amount of time into the Willkie campaign in Michigan. He later recalled in his memoirs, "I now realize that my participation did not make much difference at all to the political fate of Wendell Willkie, but it made a lot of difference to me." Ford won his first election 8 years later, getting elected to the U.S. House of Representatives from Michigan's 5th District in 1948. Jimmy Carter is arguably more famous for his peanut farming career than anything else he did prior to becoming president. But, as you might have guessed, Carter was engaged in the political world prior to his presidency, most importantly serving as the governor of Georgia. Around 1961, Carter started to publicly support integration between black and white students in public schools, a controversial position in his rural Georgia hometown. This didn't deter Carter, though, because in 1962, at the age of 38, he decided it was time to kick off his political career. He ran for the Georgia State Senate and emerged victorious, going on to serve 2 terms of 2 years each. Ronald Reagan had a long career before ever formally entering politics, serving in the U.S. Army Reserve, working as a film and radio actor, and later becoming president of the Screen Actors Guild. Reagan's formal entry into politics came in 1966, when he announced his candidacy for governor of California. But I'd actually argue his public-facing political activities began over 20 years prior. Earlier on in his life, Reagan identified with the Democratic Party, later saying, "I didn't leave the Democratic Party left me," in reference to his conversion to the Republicans. The earliest political activity I could find of Reagan's was during his time in Hollywood. In 1945, at the age of 34, Reagan actually planned to lead an anti-nuclear rally with the Hollywood Independent Citizens Committee of the Arts, Sciences, and Professions. That's a mouthful. Anyways, Warner Brothers prevented Reagan from doing this. Remember, this was during a time when major studios basically owned their actors. Around this same time, though, Reagan supported President Harry S. Truman. He was a pretty standard Hollywood Democrat by
And see,
1940 standards, and
it was-
it's interesting how much things would change
I
for him
thought
later on.
that stuff started
George H.W.
earlier in the
Bush, like a few
1930s.
of his predecessors, came from a political family. His father, Prescott Bush, was politically active starting around the early 1940s. H.W. Bush's political ambitions began only about a decade after his father's, in the year 1952, when Bush was 28 years old. 1952 was an important year for the Republican Party, because Dwight Eisenhower would lead them to their first presidential election win in 24 years. H.W. Bush played his own small part in this by volunteering for General Eisenhower's campaign, who he greatly admired and later got to personally meet. The same year, his father Prescott Bush was running for a U.S. Senate seat in Connecticut, which he won. Like I said, 1952 is a year to remember for the Republican Party, with a comeback in the presidency with Eisenhower and a hint towards the future with the Bush family coming on the scene. Bill Clinton was apparently interested in politics from a very young age, with his mother reportedly always telling him as a child that he would be president someday. You might have seen this famous photo of a young Clinton shaking hands with President John F. Kennedy, just
Right.
4 months before Kennedy's assassination. Clinton was only 16 years old in July 1963, and he said that this handshake inspired his life of public service. Clinton was able to meet Kennedy because he was sent to Washington, D.C. as a part of
And I'm going to say, I'm willing to go even before that and say when he first became a Boys Nation senator.
a program called the
I think it
American
was
Legion's Boys
1961
Nation,
or
a
62.
mock political convention. Okay, maybe this is a bit of a stretch to classify as a start in politics,
counting
but
it
it was
earlier.
too cool not to mention. I'd consider a more accurate start date for Clinton's political activities to be the next year, 1964. When Clinton was 18, he interned for Senator J. William Fulbright from Arkansas, continuing his early interest in the political sphere.
Yeah,
His 1st
I'd-
election win
I'd
would come
count,
14 years
back when
later,
he first
when he was
started.
elected the governor of Arkansas in 1978. George W. Bush, despite having a father who was heavily involved in politics, initially had no interest in following in his footsteps. Bush served in the Texas Air National Guard, worked in the oil industry, and famously co-owned the Texas Rangers.
Right.
Bush didn't run for office himself until 1978, when he was 32 years old. Bush lost an election for the U.S. House of Representatives that year, and didn't run for any position again until 1994. However, before either of these public office runs, Bush actually had a little bit of minor involvement in the political realm. The earliest political activity I could find for the future president came in 1968, when Bush was 22 years old. During this time, he was an aide for Edward Gurney's Florida campaign for U.S. Senate, which he went on to win. 4 years later, Bush served as the political director of Winton M. Blount's U.S. Senate campaign for Alabama, which Blount decisively lost. If Barack Obama will be remembered for one thing, it would probably be his oratory skills. It's only fitting that the 44th president got his start in the political world through a series of speeches. Most people were introduced to the future president through his speech at the 2004 Democratic National Convention, back when he was still a senator from Illinois. However, over 20 years earlier, Obama made his first step into politics by giving a protest speech at Occidental College when he was a sophomore. The topic of this speech was the apartheid regime in South Africa, which, as you might have guessed, Obama was opposed to. Obama continued to reference his 20-year-old self in 1981 throughout the rest of his political career, specifically citing the influence Nelson Mandela had on his career. When Mandela died in 2013, Obama released a statement, a segment of which read, "I am one of the countless millions who drew inspiration from..."
I haven't seen a transcript or if there's any surviving video of Obama's speech, although that's always something I wanted to look into. I've just never gotten around to it yet.
Nelson Mandela's life. My very first political action, the first thing I ever did that involved an issue or a policy or politics, was a protest against apartheid. I studied his words and his writings. Donald Trump easily has the most unique and unconventional ascension to the presidency in American history. I'm sure I don't need to explain his lengthy business career or his time as a reality TV star, but his history with politics is a strange one. Trump is notable for never holding any public office prior to the presidency and also did not serve in the US military, a first for US presidents. Prior to the Oval Office, Trump had financially supported plenty of political candidates, actually ran for president in 2000, and made a bunch of public political statements over the years. This is why it's difficult to specify an exact date for when Trump made his entry into the political sphere. But for the purposes of this video, I've chosen the year 1987, when Trump was 41 years old. Trump spent over $100,000 to run an advertising campaign criticizing America's foreign policy at the time, which was honestly pretty similar in rhetoric to the messaging he would run for president on 30 years later. The centerpiece of this campaign was a full-page advertisement published in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and the Washington Post. I'll link the full letter below for you to read in its entirety, but here's a quick summary. Trump viewed America as weak and called out Japan and Saudi Arabia specifically for taking advantage of the US. He believed in taxing other nations in exchange for America's global protection, and using the revenue to improve the country domestically and reduce the deficit. The purpose of this campaign was likely to gauge interest in Trump as a political candidate, probably for the 1988 presidential election, where it was speculated he would run against George H.W. Bush. Trump didn't end up running in '88, but as we all know, he did eventually run for president 4 times, 2000, 2016, 2020, and 2024, and win 2 of those elections. Finally, President Joe Biden is well known for having an incredibly long career in politics prior to his presidency, and compared to his predecessors, this is absolutely.
I'm probably actually, along with many others, are going to remember him for his stuff pre-presidency, like in the Senate. And
True.
Vice
Biden
President.
had the longest political career before becoming president, but John Quincy Adams technically has him beat if you look at total career length. Biden spent 36 years in the Senate from 1973 to 2009, and before that, 2 years as a New Castle County councilman in Delaware. However, Biden was involved politically even before that, going as far back as the late 1960s. In 1968, Biden worked for a law firm headed by William Prickett, a local Republican, and Biden actually briefly identified as a Republican himself. This was during a time where the Republicans were split between a liberal and conservative wing, and Biden aligned more with the liberal Republicans because of his dislike of Richard Nixon. This didn't last too long though, because in 1969, at the age of 26, he switched over to the Democratic Party. This was motivated by Sid Balick, the head of a new law firm.
See, I'm willing to go as far back with Biden as 1959, where he was involved in activism. Like, he didn't attend a restaurant that opposed civil rights, and was but he was, although we aren't counting like high school class president and stuff, outside of high school, Biden was involved in activism, and he did end up elected class president.
Law firm that Biden joined. Balick got Biden a spot on the local Democratic Forum, a group intending to reform the Democratic Party in Delaware. This eventually led to Biden's run for New Castle County councilman, and later his U.S. Senate seat from Delaware. So there we have it, how every U.S. president got their start in politics. Using the criteria that I did, the average age for a president to begin publicly participating in the political world would be 27.2 years old. This would be an average of 29 years before being elected to the presidency. Zachary Taylor holds the record of the oldest president to get into politics at the age of 63, and he also holds the record of shortest time between entry into politics and being elected president with less than 1 year. Remember, he was really only politically engaged for that 1848 campaign season. The youngest president to get into politics is actually a 4-way tie between Van Buren, Harding, Lyndon B. Johnson, and Clinton, all of whom were 18 years old. The longest time between entry into politics and being elected president goes to Joe Biden with 51 years, over 2 decades longer than the average.
Wow.
Anyways, that's all I've got for this time. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing. I promise it'll be worth it, and it will not be another 2 months until the next video.
All right. Thank you so much, Bay State History, for allowing me to do this. Quite an interesting video. A lot of surprising things. Found a lot of things I agreed with, a couple of them that I didn't agree with, as you would expect in video like this where some things are not cut and dry. All right. Thank you all for watching. Please like and subscribe and go and check out Bay State History.